2 p.m. Friday, November 28th, 2025. In acknowledgement of the universal light within all life, all beings, all forces, I declare for ideas, the release of new ideas, the integration and awakening to new ideas, for how there can be the development of the grand network that allows us to remember there is no separation. And in this pledge to see behind the appearances, we the people affirm all appearances are stepping stones to new forms, new appearances that can complement the interior presence, being, and potential to create a society that is in harmony with nature and with the greater chain. So, around the world, there can be little places in the square of a city, outside the government buildings or whatever, there can be a point of truth where there are trained representatives who are able to share the awareness for how institutions, how groups, how history are often twisted. In such a way to get people to think that there is a problem with free will. And, well, I don't wish to go really far into it, but there's this energy that if you can create more destruction, the more you can prove to the architect that all of this was wrong, flawed from the very beginning. But if we look at the big picture, there is a thread of guidance to higher principles, higher beings of intelligence. Throughout the ages, however, how loose of a thread, how thin of a thread, from which there might be the will to express the next level of consciousness. And for this area of San Francisco and many other places around the world, it can be a big place of population, it could be a small place. But for there to be trained representatives in the mysteries, life is a mystery in itself that can never fully be known and defined to an absolute. And sometimes the yang will say the absolute truth is constant transcendence. But what does that look like in our society? What is possible? What is realistic? What is practical? What is able to be done? There can be people in the city square, offering universal forms of medicine, health, comfort, nurturance, nutrition, psychological, spiritual assistance. Individuals there can be areas where there are encouraged conversations and places where there is like a live stream from different places around the world where people of different countries can connect. In New York, I think New York City, there is something like that connects to Ireland. But anyways, even just having one person who may not be the best of his class, but is in a particular field that is studying and trying to become a teacher in the arts of light, of vibration, of frequency, of excellence, stewardship. These places can be bastions for warmth, for fire, for the exploration of our gifts, the questioning of our gifts, debate, meditation, scientific innovations. There can be even like a biodome. But the question is, how will the representatives be trained, and how will the resources and the finances be able to come together? And that is a matter of having a vision of the living word that is embedded within every soul. And that word understands a certain way to communicate to people at different states of consciousness. How there may be a shift in the conditions, in the status quo, in the modern gridlock dynamic. How many signatures, how many petitions, how many referendums, how many organizations, how many very important people. And there will be people with various superpowers, so to speak, specialties, gifts, that will be able to do things that might seem like what 1 million people or 1 billion people are incapable of doing. But it's not to put oneself above another. But anyways, in representation of the people in areas like this, there is an ideal that can be tuned into, and the money that goes into defense, into incarceration, into surveillance, and how shall we say, the weaponization, the militarization of authority figures, or people who may seem to have authority but really are trying to use fear and division and anger and violence in order to suggest there is a greater authority than the elite, than the original decision of the original inhabitants of the earth to choose a conflict. And there are different interpretations to how the original inhabitants of the earth choose conflict, how they choose standstill, how they choose normalcy and the eradication of diversity, how that led to the impasse of the entire planet being able to continue to really grow, but rather self-destruct. But that doesn't mean the soul race self-destructed. We are still here, but some planets do not make it in a certain, even though the energy is recycled and transferred into eventually, in my understanding, the great plan of seeing a way to broadcast a radio station to the horizontal position, factor, variable, which I consider as the people, and the vertical station, frequency of the leaders, the elders, the architects, the facilitators and administrators of consciousness, the elements, the cycles, the ideas to a certain respect, as humanity comes to terms with the perversions through each of the institutions, perversions of their own illusion that tries to act as an institution over the soul, who ultimately comes to believe in a certain sense that it is limited by looking through a certain filter, in which there could be a whole history of lifetimes of suppression, trauma, war, killing, fear, death, scars, trauma, addiction, desolation. But through the lifetimes, it is important to recognize that the grounding position of the ideal into law, into normalcy, into the everyday person's life requires a certain will to align yourself with the central point of what you consider humanity for your local circumstances, and possibly even for the planetary circumstance, which I find this place, but also the phone, as a great instrument to help magnify the awareness that will eventually shift the equation from a small group of people owning most of the wealth of the world to the people. And so, in honor of the universal intelligence, the light, the being, the entity, the force behind this world and many numberless numbers of worlds, I acknowledge the will to accelerate the momentum from which we may be able to integrate non-duality, giving up the us versus them, good versus evil, right versus wrong, beautiful versus ugly. But now that more sound has entered the atmosphere, I now shift this cycle of recording. And I believe they are taking a break, but I don't. But anyways, Do I have anything else that I would like to say on this wonderful day? I see that there can be a live 24/7 market, but also emergency station for psychological, spiritual, biological, physiological conditions. But the institutions need to come to terms with consciousness, the fair distribution of wealth and resources, the regulation of the economy, of big business, big money, fractional reserve banking, fiat currency. Even though we are headed towards a digital currency, and it can still work, but the point was these spaces, these types of spaces around the world, or even small villages where there's probably like a little, I don't know, fire pit, I don't know. I feel there can be assistance, food, shelter, clothing, hygiene. There is no limit to the imagination of what you can do almost with so much area. Obviously, a lot of this area is held down by the status quo through generational elitism, centralization of power. It looks nice, but on a certain side, there's a lot of people in these areas that need many different types of assistance. But ultimately, as the soul comes to realize, we are the ultimate ones that define our internal conditions and consciousness. Maybe consciousness is the right term, because sometimes there are forces that put a certain test or initiation on our physical body. But anyways, a 24/7 live space for creativity, experimentation, exploration. Where is the money going to come from? The defense industry. We're not here to abolish our weapons and defense and military right away, but we can work our way down gradually and create a system that shows that deterrence has a certain value, but if it's significantly outweighed by the investment and the consideration of how to use nonviolence, how to use consciousness, how to use certain forms of art, certain forms of light, sound, frequency, certain geometry, certain architecture, you can create initiations for people to realize there is no death. You can create centers that show how it's after death. Like you can have a whole pyramid, a 3D pyramid. Oh, whoops, sorry. It doesn't have to be a pyramid building shape, but you can give people certain imagery and sound and have them go through an experience of seeing how the soul, through meditation or through film or through other elements, song, music, that we come back oftentimes with a primal fear of death, a primal fear of doing something different, but not just like skydiving or rock climbing, but also considering humanity without actually feeling attached to the idea that's been around for so long that suffering is bad. And that's what's happening should not be happening, when in fact there may be some truth but to that statement, but at the same time these things are considered for the creation of the worlds, that these things can happen, or the decision makers, the inhabitants of the earth. there are many, who are not original inhabitants of the earth. Who have forgotten. That's okay, because the cycles will come where eventually we will realize once again. But how much money are we talking for an initiative of a few people to share awareness, information, wisdom, humanity, compassion, courage, discernment, balance, purity, of vision, of service, of freedom through democratized decision making? Anyways, I see the universal light. I see the principle of the heart, the fire of our essence, and I see it manifesting over time through day-by-day decisions of those who have the will to choose life, to choose the dance and the grand puzzle, to see that our consciousness begins to manifest into reality in a certain way in which is not attached to it being a very specific way. But there is a certain art to this process. One, or A, by letting go of when it will manifest and how exactly it will look like, and B, number 2, that we are unattached to even having to have physical results in our lifetime. That can be ideal, but the physical results around the world, where there are a few people and places of leadership, bureaucracy, governance, and there's also reasons one can say why it would be important to have representatives all around the population. But anyways, do I have anything else that I would like to say? Do I have anything else I'd like to say? And if someone just holds a document right there of their experience of life facing this way, and that document expresses their experience, their truth, their honesty, their perhaps biases, their own illnesses, their own illusions, as I have some, others have theirs. But with the conclusion of all this, I would like to let go and simply say, let there be light. And I affirm, there is only light.